based on domestic violence and happening both ways, and definitely we know that the majority of victims are women if we look at what's going on. Am I correct?
I think traditionally the majority of victims have been women. I think with people that are older, I think the majority probably still are women. Again,
Mm.
with some of the younger generation where the gender roles are so different, um, a little less traditional, as we'll say. I think we're seeing more and more male victims.
So we are
And
almost 50
I think
50.
I think it's important because working in domestic violence, again, over 30 years, the perception, or I should say the misperception, of people that worked in domestic violence, those of us that we were all a bunch of, man hating lesbians,
Mm-hmm.
um, which is so far from the truth. The word hate is pretty strong, and it's really the violence that's unacceptable, and certainly not men. I mean, there are a lot of really good men out there. Um, but I think knowing that anybody, again, domestic violence doesn't have a certain face. So we have to know that anybody can be a victim and to look at every situation and every partnership differently and within the confines of that relationship, and not just look at the gender, but look at the situation. We see it a lot with gay and lesbian relationships where traditionally they were thought, we used to call it the double closet. They were thought to be either just a cat fight or, two guys having a brawl. But intimate partner violence is intimate partner violence, whether people are the same sex or different sex.
So, talking about the rise in male victims in nowadays time with the younger generations as opposed, and that's a very, very, very powerful statement you made, that traditionally women were the majority, basically, generally speaking, the majority of victims in domestic violence. But in recent times with the younger generation, it's men. Now, that brings me to another point of crime and murder. All right, crime, murder, violence. Yeah, people know it's a slap, it's a beat, it's a fight, it's a beater, wife beater, husband beater, whatever it may be. But that brings me to the point of crime. What do you have to say about crime in
But
the world?
interestingly enough, you know, and I don't blame the media, but I think the media needs some education here, because very often it's called domestic violence until it's a murder, and then they call it murder, they don't call it domestic violence.
Yeah, I like that point, and I have always wondered because in my profession, we do a lot of counseling. We do a lot of counseling for marriages and do counseling for people. And you made a fantastic point there, Dr. Laura. And the media needs to be just and not be fake. They need to speak the truth. A lot of times you hear of a murder, you hear of a crime. And I have spoken to people in different countries throughout the world on crime. And many a times the crime, as opposed to theft and this kind of murder, a lot of times their murder is because one spouse caused or paid someone or was behind the murder of the next spouse. And the media comes up and says it's just a crime and does not say what was the reason behind it. And here you have this triangle love situation, this sort of hidden love, and someone pays someone off to murder somebody. It was not it was not like stealing, it was not theft, it was just shoot and disappear. And if you would really track the history of that, it's a spouse that was behind that murder.
Well, and I think very often, in investigations, the spouse is always the first person that they look at. Um, Again, it's that if I can't have you, nobody will, and it's really looking and calling it what it is, that it's a domestic violence murder or domestic violence homicide, and not just a murder. I shouldn't say just murder, because murder is murder, but it's not a stranger or somebody in the community. The person that's doing the murdering is the person that the victim loved and trusted, the person that was supposed to keep them safe, very often the person that they had a child or children with that took their life. And that's very significant. And I think it's also important for people to see how often it happens, because it happens much more often than people realize. And people think when we talk about, domestic violence murder, that, oh, that hardly ever happens, or you're catastrophizing or being a drama queen. But the truth is, it happens much more often than people realize, and it's happening more and more often.
That makes so much sense, and I really, really agree with you that the media needs to be honest with the viewers, because when it comes to a robbery, you hear about robbery and crime and murder. You always hear about drugs and murder, but when it comes to violence and domestic violence, they do not. I mean, I know they cannot analyze the situation and jump to a conclusion, but just as they attach robbery and drugs at some point in time to a murder case, they should, because that may be a form of education to spouses, that they will be exposed, and very much exposed, not just the lawyers and the court, and it's a hidden thing that the husband was behind the wife's murder or the wife was behind her husband's murder. But people need to be educated about this, because this domestic violence will just continue growing.
I think that's a really important point, and with the education, and I don't think the media is being dishonest. I think when somebody's killed, then they call it a murder. And again, when you know better, you do better, and you call it a murder, it is a murder.
It is a murder, yes.
They're just not, it's just, like Paul Harvey used to say, you need the rest of the story. And very often, explaining and maybe doing some education with domestic violence and murder and how things escalate and, how that happens.
So the media is not dishonest, but they're just not telling us everything. I think that's a way to go, because I mean, from an educational point of view, I'm just saying that because I have seen and I've heard of a lot of these murder cases, and because of counseling and all these things, and when you're contacted, I was able to realize that it had something from a domestic line. Maybe the spouse did not commit the murder directly, but was very influential in the setup. And that's very sad. That's very sad. But anyhow.
Well, I think it's very sad. But the other thing, until people have all the facts, or until it's tried in court, you also have to be very careful, what you say, unless you're 100% sure, because you don't want, the current situation or the media or public perception to interfere with the potential for a just hearing.
Well, that's correct, and you're totally correct. And those are the technicalities in investigation and crime and murder, etc. Otherwise, it may just lead to more crime and more murder.